Okay, hello. Whoops. Hello, everybody. My name is Hans Zenger. I'm head of unit at the European Commission's Chief Economist team. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I speak strictly personally here today and not for the European Commission. And what we're going to talk about later as well in the Q&A is European merger control. So the biggest event that we're having at the moment is that we're revising our merger guidelines. I mean, the US revised their guidelines not so long ago, obviously, and so our guidelines, they're from 2004, the horizontal merger guidelines, so a lot has happened in the time between, and of course also our merger enforcement has changed a lot during that time, so there is a lot to update and a lot to change. Now the big political background surrounding this change in the merger guidelines I think is a political drive for competitiveness. Europe has issues with competitiveness, European markets have issues with competitiveness, and so there's a strong political impulse and that provides a little bit the let's say regulatory environment for the change in guidelines that we're about to have. Very soon we're going to publish draft guidelines, and then they will go out for public consultation, and I'm sure some of you will also use the opportunity to to make recommendations how we can make them even better. So the two main changes that these guidelines will bring about are, on the one hand, a greater focus on dynamics, a more dynamic view on merger control, and the second one is a greater role also for efficiencies, which sort of, I think in merger control law generally, not only in the EU but around the globe, I think have been less prominent than they might have been, certainly from the perspective of an economist like myself. So what does that mean, more dynamics? So, when our old guidelines were written in 2004, recall there was a time when, Facebook was founded in 2004. So, these guidelines were not written with dynamic markets or tech markets in mind. So, even parts like, foreclosure or non-horizontal effects more generally, they had much more in mind the traditional industries that were dominating at the time. And so in some ways, there has been an evolution over the last 20 years, in our case, practice, and that's going to be central to the guidelines that are going to come out very soon. Now, I said that competitiveness, and especially competitiveness of the European economy, is a big focus on those guidelines. And when politicians talk about competitiveness of Europe, then usually they do that with a reference to China, and that, I guess, is the right competitor, because the rise of China has changed so much of the global competition dynamics. But what people do very little is to look at how China itself actually is running its industrial policy. And when you look, there's basically two things that stand out. One is that the industrial policy approach of China is in many ways outward looking. So is the idea that is to bring own technologies and own products around the world, and conquering foreign markets with them. The second thing that is a characteristic is that Chinese companies in their industrial policy at home have really a focus on relentless competition. So that's something that really happens across a number of industries that China has conquered over the last 10, 15 years, from solar panels to batteries to e-mobility. So in China at the moment, obviously, as you all know, there's dozens and dozens of car manufacturers with e-mobility. So the idea, obviously, is create a situation where you have a conducive environment for investment and subsidies at home, and then have these guys fight it out until, at the end, only a few firms survive, and the toughest ones, after having survived that tough competition at home, of course, will be extraordinarily competitive when they go abroad and compete for market share in the US and Europe and elsewhere. Now, this sort of approach of China of focusing on outward competition and focusing on locally having very competitive markets, that's not exactly the type of narratives that you see from some European companies in this debate about global competitiveness. So, for example, if you look at the most vocal sectors that in this debate in Europe, that's probably telecoms and perhaps airlines to a degree. These sectors, they want scale, and obviously scale is a very important thing in a fragmented market such as Europe. But the scale they want is not exactly a scale of being able to compete across the market in Europe and fight with each other, but is more sort of a view of a fragmented Europe where you have different companies who have a controlling sphere of influence. So they want to merge locally and gain scale by having these local pockets of a fragmented markets. The reason why from a business perspective is relatively clear. If I look at my mobile telephony contract or generally my telco contracts in Belgium, you pay like 100-something euro for a package that includes internet and telephony and so forth. For the same thing in Spain, you pay 35 euros if you're with one of the competitive private firms. So, how would the Belgian incumbent do against those companies if they had to compete on a European market? Well, probably there would be a lot of firms who have a problem. So, from our perspective and in devising those merger guidelines, we're not in the business of trying to provide presence for local monopolies. We see it as our goal to help the business environment and to create a situation where firms have the ability to scale up and to enter new markets and to make mergers that make them stronger and make them better competitors. But that does not mean, on the other hand, that we view that sort of having local monopolies is a very good idea to get to competitiveness. And so with this, I will end my starting words, and then we can do the Q&A. Thank you.